Good morning. I'd like to begin by thanking Division 20 for inviting me to participate in this symposium. I'm pleased to be here, and honored to be here. I'm not sure exactly when lifespan developmental approach was born, but I do know that it was fathered by Warner Shaya. And Warner places the official birth date in 1966. This occurred when, after discussions with Jim Burren, who at the time was head of NICHD and was and continued to be a longtime leader in Division 20, Warner submitted and received a training grant in lifespan development at West Virginia University. And if lifespan was born in 1966, then its christening had to be in May 1969, when the first conference on lifespan developmental psychology was held at West Virginia University. It was at this point that I entered the picture when my colleague, Hein Rees, invited me to co-author a paper to be presented at this first conference. We wrote and presented the paper, and it was published in 1970 as a chapter in the first of a long series of lifespan developmental psychology text. The title of the paper was Models of Development and Theories of Development. And our primary thesis then, as mine is today, was that, like other sciences, the fledgling lifespan developmental psychology would function within the context of a broad set of concepts that generally go unnoticed in the background in day-to-day research and activities. These background ideas constitute the conceptual framework or conceptual context within which day-to-day research and intervention activities operate. The particular set of background ideas, or what today would be called meta-theoretical concepts, that we focused upon our analysis were on what Stephen Pepper, the philosopher, termed the mechanistic and the organismic worldviews. And it was what Thomas Kuhn was terming scientific paradigms. We chose those paradigms because at the time in psychology, virtually all of psychology was mechanistic in nature and was seen, which was seen to be the standard, and the organismic was its only challenger. Wrong way. Now, I have to take a couple of minutes for a prequel to this early writing and to the subsequent theoretical and empirical work that I've done. When I was an undergraduate at Boston University in the late 1950s, the only scientific psychology available, not just at BU, but everywhere, was behaviorism. My world of scientific psychology, that is experimental and even experimental child psychology, was a world encapsulated by the logo SR, stimulus and response. To be scientific in this world, it was required that all the interesting actions of people be reduced to observable movements, responses, and the environmental or biological events, stimuli, that were believed to produce them. At times, intervening variables were introduced, i.e. mediators, but these were necessarily ultimately defined in terms of, and only in terms of, the overt stimuli and responses that were believed to produce them. The prevailing behaviorism of the time was identified with the grand learning theories and grand drive theories, especially the work of Clark Hull and Kenneth Spence, known as the Hull-Spence theory, with B.F. Skinner a relatively minor, although rapidly emerging, important contributor. In this setting, if developmental was ever mentioned, and it was not a very popular word, it was thought of as a long temporal string of S's and R's. Development, along with concepts like cognition, or higher mental processes as they were called in the day, were thought of as a set of issues to be ignored as non-scientific that would one day in the future find a naturalized solution as strictly empirical generalizations induced from the laws to be discovered in the field of stimuli and responses. Although it was de rigueur at the time to deny the scientific value of any philosophical concepts, the hegemony of behaviorism was, in fact, supported by a number of philosophical positions popular at the time under the general heading of radical empiricism. The most important of these philosophical principles was the epistemology of radical empiricism itself. This stated that knowledge comes through pristine, that is, uninterpreted or interpretation-free observations, and only pristine observations. Other supportive philosophical principles were an atomism and foundationalism, that is, the idea that there is an ultimately fixed bedrock reality, and complex entities must be analytically reduced to this bedrock. A physicalism, that is, the idea that the physical constitutes the ultimate, non-reducible, really real bedrock. And finally, an objectivism or scientific realism, that is, the assertion that objects of scientific knowledge exist independently of the minds of the scientists, and that scientific theories are true of that objective world. These features of radical empiricism, in turn, form the basis for the philosophical scientific methodology called neopositivism. According to the neopositivist creed, a theoretical concept, a proposition, whether it be a concept, a hypothesis, a theoretical proposition, or a law, was scientifically meaningful or not meaningful according to two rules. The first rule was that a proposition could be accepted as scientifically meaningful if and only if it could be reduced to words whose meaning could be directly observed and pointed to. The words whose meaning could be directly observed constituted a natural observational language, completely objective and free from subjective or mind-dependent interpretations. Thus, all theoretical language required reduction to pristine observations and a neutral observational language. Because not each and every proposition in the major personality and developmental theories of the day were so reducible, for example, the theories of Jean Piaget, Heinz Werner, Jerry Bruner, Erik Erikson, etc., these theories became prime targets as exemplars of scientifically meaningless theories. The second rule is a long rule. It breaks down to the propositions must be empirical generalizations inductively derived from pristine observations. When the notion of science as a hypothetico-deductive method was introduced by Hull, nothing really changed because it was understood that the hypothetico was not referring to inferential or interpretive hypotheses. The hypothetico was referring to earlier inductively derived empirical generalizations, and the deduction was merely a formal heuristic for moving from empirical generalization back down to pristine observation to repeat the observation inductive generalization process. Obviously, with the hegemony of behaviorism, radical empiricism, and neopositivism, there was no room for discussions of paradigms or worldviews in this world of scientific psychology. Only later did I realize that, in fact, this whole structure was framed by a mechanistic paradigm. In 1960, when I entered the PhD program at Clark University, I entered a very new world, and my introduction to that world was primarily guided by Heinz Werner and Bernie Kaplan. This was a world whose past had represented an opposition to behaviorism, to radical empiricism, and to neopositivism, and whose present was beginning to represent the emergence of a number of newly respectable scientific developmental and cognitive developmental perspectives. It was, in fact, I later learned, an organismic world. This was a time of truly revolutionary change in psychology, and that change came to be called the cognitive revolution. Few agree about the specific date of the revolutionary shift. Some date it to 1956, when Brunner, Goodenow, and Austin published their influential A Study of Thinking, and the year after Jean Piaget founded the International Center for Genetic Epistemology in Geneva, Switzerland. In 1957, a new edition of Werner's Comparative Psychology of Mental Development was published. In the same year saw the publication of the highly influential book titled The Concept of Development, edited by Dale Harris, which contained very non-behavioristic chapters by Harris, Werner, T.C. Schneerler, and others. Certainly, the 1957 publication of Syntactic Structures by Chomsky and his 1959 review of Skinner's Verbal Behavior were important dates. So too was 1960, when at Harvard, Brunner created the Center for Cognitive Studies. Regardless of any specific date, and regardless of the later diversions into information processing and cognitive science, we at Clark and at other schools around the country and in Europe lived the revolution the way Brunner later described it. Quote, "The revolution was intended to bring mind back into the human sciences after a long, cold, hard winter of objectivism. It was an all-out effort to establish meaning as the central concept of psychology, not stimuli and responses, not over-observable behavior, not biological drives in their transformation, but meaning. Its aim was to prompt psychology to join forces with its sister interpretive disciplines in the humanities and in the social sciences. We were not out to reform behaviorism, we were out but to replace it." Close quote. It was in this world that I learned about Werner and Kaplan's organismic developmental theory, which, by the way, maintains that development is a lifelong process. It was in this world that in 1963, I first read Thomas Kuhn's Structure of Scientific Revolution and the discussion of scientific paradigms. And it was in this world that I read Pepper's World Hypotheses and a number of similarly minded philosophers. And finally, it was in this world that I accepted my colleague Hayne Reese's offer to co-author a paper at the first West Virginia Lifespan Conference. Hayne himself came to this world along a very different path, having been for a number of years a dyed-in-the-wool Spence Hall behaviorist with a number of behaviorist publications to his credit. However, in the context of the cognitive revolution, Hayne, like a number of his colleagues, was becoming rapidly disillusioned with behaviorism. When Hayne invited me to co-author the West Virginia Lifespan paper, I told him I would agree if and only if he read Pepper's World Hypotheses and found enough value in it to use it as the framework for our paper. He read it, agreed to his value, and we wrote the paper. So that ends my rather lengthy prequel. What happened next is that the chapter turned out to be quite successful. That is, a lot of people read it and a lot of people cited it. So we wrote a few more articles and chapters along similar lines, some appearing in later volumes of the Lifespan Developmental Psychology series. But somewhere along the line, a third, Stephen Pepper defined worldview began to become popular as the conceptual foundation for Skinnerian operant psychologists, and later for many lifespan developmental psychologists. This worldview is called contextualism, and it would take far too long to describe contextualism adequately here. But let me try to give a brief description. The basic metaphor that gives rise to organicism is the process of organic development of the living system. The basic metaphor that gives rise to contextualism is the ongoing act in context. Both organicism and contextualism are holistic, but the whole for organicism is the system and its interrelated parts, while the whole for contextualism is the whole overt observable act. Further, organicism is integrative in the sense of focusing on the integration of the system and making interpretive inferences about the organization and change of organization of that system. Contextualism, on the other hand, is said to be dispersive, as ongoing acts are related to each other when they are observed to be so related. Initially, contextualism had, as I said, a great appeal to operant behaviorists, who came to believe that this paradigm, with its focus on the actual observable acts, was a better fit for their position than the mechanistic paradigm. This operant enthusiasm for contextualism has not faded with the years. While contextualism remained highly popular among operant behaviorists, as time passed, a central figure in the lifespan movement, Paul Baltus, along with others, took contextualism to be the paradigm for lifespan development, and within this context also argued for a functional theory of development. I would like to parenthetically say I deeply regret that we don't have Paul with us. Paul made so many seminal contributions. He was such a fantastic leader of the lifespan. He and I were always Mr. Thesis and Antithesis, had many discussions, and I would love to hear his critique of the synthesis that I'm going to try to do today. So, as I said, Paul, along with others, took contextualism to be the paradigm, and within the context also argued for a functional theory of development. As Baltus et al. Said in 2006, quote, "Ontogenetic and historical contextualism as paradigm. In principle, the biological and cultural architecture of human development is incomplete and subject to continuous change, with biological and cultural factors co-constructing and modifying each other. Thus, ontogenetic development varies markedly by historical cultural conditions. The mechanisms involved can be characterized as principles associated with biocultural contextualism," close quote. And, quote, "We approach the conceptualization of development by a theoretical framework of neo-functionalism and contextualism. With that approach, the nature of adaptive change with lifespan development is driven by considerations of a larger set of influences and the kind of challenges that people face as their lives unfold. In our view, such a neo-functional approach is the most open to a full consideration of the new facets of ontogenetic change that lifespan researchers are confronted with." This prevalence of the contextualist understanding of lifespan development is further illustrated by the fact that in the information that was sent out for this symposium, a definition of lifespan was included, and this definition closely follows the Baltus et al. Model. So, here we have a potential controversial arena. I had for years been arguing from an organismic point of view that in considering development, including lifespan development, the focus of our efforts should be on the person as a dynamic, that is, active, changing system, and we should consider development of this system to entail both transformational change, that is, change in the form or organization of the system itself, and variational change, that is, change in the overt acts of the system. Contextualism, on the other hand, limits its focus to overt observable acts, the behavior, and developmental changes are seen as being driven by biological and cultural influences. And further, the notion of a dynamic system is totally discounted in this approach because a system implies making inferences from actions rather than just staying with the observable act, as contextualism insists that we do. What we seem to have here is a real split, a real dichotomy, in the understanding of lifespan development. The question is there any possible rapprochement between the organismic and contextualist understandings? The answer is yes. But to demonstrate that, I have to say a few words about what is currently being termed the process-relational scientific paradigm. Specifically, for present purposes, I'd like to focus on the relational features of this paradigm. The relational position entails several principles that are designed as a whole to turn what seem to be fundamental splits or dichotomies or antinomies, like nature-nurture, mind-body, self-other, structure-function, into indissociable relational complementarities. I won't bore you with the technical principles involved. Instead, I will just ask you to inspect the following drawing that illustrates the relational position. Here, one might ask the split or dichotomous question, which hand is drawing and which hand is being drawn? But you can see, from a relational perspective, this question makes no sense. Both are drawing and both are being drawn. They form an indissociable relational complementarity. They are co-constitutive. Now, what happens if we take any of the traditional dichotomies and place one term of the dichotomous pair on one hand and its supposed contradiction on the other? Here, for example, the previously dichotomous biology and culture become transformed into a relational complementarity. This means it is no longer possible to examine split-off biological influences or split-off cultural influences. You can see they are co-constitutive. So, for example, any act is 100% biological because it's 100% cultural, and 100% cultural because it's 100% biological. This does not mean that a relational position maintains it is impossible to study from a biological and/or cultural point of view. Quite the opposite. But if you try to take a relational position, you cannot treat biology and culture as independent entities, each having its own unique impact on overt action. Nor can you claim their impact to be the additive interaction of the two. But now let's look at a situation closer to our current problem. Here I place structure, that is system or organization of process, on one hand, and the act on the other hand. Here, if you take a relational position, it immediately becomes obvious that you can never have structure without function, nor can you have function without structure. In other words, structures function, that is, systems are active, and functions have structures, that is, acts emerge from some organization. From this relational position, then, it makes no sense to talk about taking a neo-functionalist approach to anything, because neo-functionalism implies the splitting of structure and function, and it also implies that any consideration of structural, that is, system issues, are meaningless. It is also the case that from a relational position, it would make no sense to try to take a neo-structuralist position. Now, keeping this relational position in mind, let's see if we can't come to a principled, not eclectic, but a principled rapprochement between organicism and contextualism. Stephen Pepper himself pointed out that it is tempting to regard these two paradigms as a species of a single paradigm, one being dispersive, contextualism, the other being integrative, organicism. Indeed, both share inherent activity and change as being categorical. And as mentioned earlier, although they operate somewhat differently, in each paradigm, they also share a holistic and dialectic orientation. However, Pepper ultimately rejected the two species of a single paradigm solution because he maintained that dispersive and integrative constitute a, quote, flat categorical contradiction, close quote. But is this so? not from a relational position. From a relational position, this supposed contradiction becomes converted into a relational complementarity. Integrative refers to the organization of the dynamic system. Dispersive refers to the differentiated variable actions of the system. The effect of moving integration differentiation from a split frame to a relational frame is that organicism and contextualism do, in fact, become species of the same paradigm. And this is what Rich Lerner and I and others have been referring to as the process relational paradigm. Because organicism is said to have a vertical cosmology, and contextualism is said to have a horizontal cosmology, the process relational synthesis can best be pictured as here, by the intersection of a vertical plane and a horizontal plane of a differentiated and integrated figure. For present purposes, we'll apply this paradigm to the living organism. In this case, the horizontal axis represents the observable act of the organism, and the vertical axis represents the organism, that is, the system performing the acts. Now, it should be obvious that it is in the land of variation or variability that the Baltus and L understanding of lifespan development resides. And I would totally agree with much of this position, because it's in this land that behaviors may be blocked, substituted, and novel acts may appear. I also agree that this is the land of multidimensional and multi-directional change. Further, I can also agree that in this variational land, to quote Baltus et al., development advances are due to processes of optimization, close quote. Having said all of this, I would remind you that we're talking about a relational position. And so the source of these observable acts, the vertical axis, becomes critically important also. And the source of these behaviors is a system, an active organization that Rich Lerner and I began several years ago to describe as the relational developmental system, or the relational developmental system metamodel. What's important is how the relational developmental system develops, how it comes to be transformed. And here's how that works. Please note the following slide. I'm sorry, this is all the aspects of the relational developmental system that I wasn't going to talk about. I just wanted to show you, so I did. Okay, so here's how this relational developmental system development comes about. Any act emerges from the current organization, from the structure of the embodied relational developmental system. Let's say, as an example, the relational developmental system's current organization entails sensory motor schemes and practical acts. No representational organization, no symbolic acts. Further, let me say that it's important to realize that all acts, practical or symbolic, are embodied. And embodiment is the claim that the kind of body we have is a constitutive precondition for the kind of behaviors, experiences, and meanings that we have. Embodiment includes not merely the physical structure of the body, but the body as a form of lived experience, actively engaged with the world of sociocultural and physical objects. So this embodied act is projected onto the world. If the act is complete, that is, if the act is adaptive, that is, if it attains its object, then you get no change, you get no development. Most acts, however, are not complete. And if this is the case, then variational activity occurs. Ultimately, one variation, or a combination of variation, occurs that does achieve its intended object. Then, through various positive and negative feedback loops, the variations, including the novel acts, feed back to the system, and the system incorporates the feedback, which results in a change in the organization of the system. That is, the system is transformed. Or to say this another way, the system becomes differentiating. System differentiation, which is a prelude to reintegration, is a transformation in the system. Thus, if one is looking from the transformational side of the relational developmental system, then the transformation act leads to variational acts, leads to transformation, leads to variation, etc. And if one is looking from the variational side, then variational act leads to transformational, of the system leads to variation, etc. The important point is that development is always the result of embodied actions that arise out of the organization of the active system, and it returns to change the organization of the system. And now to my final point, and this is about major transformations of the relational developmental system, or what we might term qualitative changes in the system. As we know from work on dynamic systems, for any nonlinear, complex, dynamic, self-constructing, and self-organizing system, that is the relational developmental system or the living organism, eventually the system differentiation leads to major changes in what is called the phase structure of the system. This is a qualitative transformation that entails coordinations, that is, system integrations of system differentiations. That is, the system undergoes a novel, emergent reintegration. Here, we have novel emergent actions, for example, the use of symbols, that are the result of a novel emergent system characteristics, that is, the emergence of representational system. In developmental science generally, these transformations are usually referred to as stages or levels of action. And thus, in this figure, you will see stages of mind, where mind is defined as overlapping subsystems, the cognitive, the emotional, and motivational. These emergent transformations move from the practical level of sensory motor system to the symbolic level of representational system to second and third order representational systems, and who knows, perhaps beyond. It's important to note, finally, that these higher systems do not destroy earlier systems, but rather they subsume them. So an individual can act upon all 3 or 4 levels of the system. And so this represents what I believe to be a principled, not eclectic, and integration of organicism and contextualism. In closing, I would just like to say, I do hope you will consider this integration as you go about your lifespan research and intervention activities. Among other features, this integration has the advantage of inclusivity over exclusivity. And isn't that what lifespan development is all about? Finally, I do apologize for not having had time to say anything specific about adult development and aging. I do have things to say about that, and they're consistent with my talk. But if you're interested, I'm afraid you'll have to explore my introductory chapter in Volume 1 of the Handbook of Lifespan Development. Thank you.